So by way of an introduction, my name is Nicki. I'm the CEO and CTO of a company called OpenCredo. We're a hands-on software development consultancy based out of London. And we help our clients to build distributed architectures, cloud-native systems, data solutions. And platform engineering is also another area where we do quite a bit of work. And I'm going to be speaking about some of my experiences in working with different clients as to why sometimes it seems to be so hard to actually create these things. So the agenda for the talk is that we're just going to start off initially by setting some context. So what exactly is platform engineering? We then want to have a look at what is this platform as a product concept. It seems to be key to doing this right, so we should understand that. And then we'll get into the meat of the talk, which is really what are the stumbling blocks that people tend to run into when they try and implement this. And then finally, we'll finish off with what actually does a good user-centric platform look like, and finish with a conclusion. But first, let's start off with defining what exactly is platform engineering. So this is a definition from the State of DevOps report from 2023, and it talks about platform engineering as being the discipline of designing and building safe self-service capabilities to minimize cognitive load for developers and enable fast flow software delivery. A little bit of a mouthful, but if we break that down, essentially platform engineering is a socio-technical discipline which combines two pieces. There's a social part, and there's also a technical part. And together, these two provide a way to be able to help your internal developers within an organization really make it easy for them to build and deploy and run their products into production. Now, on the technical side, this generally involves building what's called an internal developer platform. And this will generally have certain properties or characteristics. So it'll generally be quite sort of self-service, which means that the teams can just consume the services that they need as and when they go along. They don't necessarily have to engage with humans along the way. And it's also there to take the burden of building some of the really sort of heavy lifting parts of the outer sort of areas of building systems that people don't necessarily do as part of the business side of things. So, for example, building your infrastructure and your environments and doing all of this type of stuff. But as I said, it's not just about the technical side, there's also this sort of social side to it. So as part of making a platform experience really good for your users to consume, you also need to think about how do we support this? So this involves things like having professional services and support teams available, as well as maybe developer relation type functions, which can evangelize the platform and, basically let people know, look, this is what the platform can do for you as an internal developer. So this represents essentially what the answer is to what is platform engineering. But one of the interesting things to probably ask is why do we even need platform engineering in the first place? And I want to go back and just have a look at this because it's going to help us when we try and explore some of the stumbling blocks moving forward. So first of all, what were some of the problems, what were some of the drivers that actually resulted in us getting to the place where platform engineering seems to be the answer? So there's two main drivers that typically come up from a business perspective, when platform engineering is involved. And the first one is really that businesses are looking to scale. So they might start out small with maybe sort of tens of developers, but then they get to the point where they need hundreds or thousands of developers and multiple teams to actually deliver whatever product it is that they're building. In conjunction with this, they're often looking to increase the speed of the delivery. And this is because, from a competitive perspective, this is naturally something that is going to be required in order for businesses to survive. So those are two main things. There's often other drivers as well. So for example, having to comply with security and regulatory compliance is something which is coming up quite a lot. But also things like needing to accelerate your innovation and sometimes even cut costs. However, I would say in parallel to this, or sometimes even as a result of this, I think there's a recognition that the current way that businesses are trying to scale and do this is not quite working. It's not quite, it has some deficiencies. And this is because if you think about how we've evolved over time, we started with waterfall. There was a lot of siloed sort of teams. Agile came along and said, let's put the business together, the testers, the developers, and we got a self-contained team that would help us to actually move faster. That was great, that got us to a certain point. Then we hit the next roadblock, which was people having to throw the deployment over the wall to operations. And so we decided to go for DevOps, and DevOps ended up bringing the operational folk into the mix as well. And this is where you got the you build it, you run it type mentality from, because, principle from. So suddenly you had a team that was able to take everything from understanding the business to building and deploying out, which is really good because it allows things to go really fast. The problem is when you as a business are really trying to scale and you're going into the thousands of developers, this just isn't practical anymore. And the reason why it's not practical is because there's a lot of sort of complexity that has crept into, especially the sort of infrastructure deployment and this side of things in terms of the teams that have to do this. So as a result, you'll end up with developers they're not really able to just build their business logic anymore. They've got to worry about how do I configure Kubernetes? How do I build my pipelines? How do I do all of this other stuff? And it takes away from the main focus of just building their systems. And this also creates hiring challenges because the organizations are unable to get these externals or these specialized expertise into all of the different hundreds or thousands of sort of teams that are out there. So if we know this is the sort of challenge, this is the challenges that we face, what were some of the sort of considerations and the decisions which resulted in us actually moving to platform engineering as an answer? So the first one is to recognize that actually the current model doesn't quite work. It doesn't scale. So we need a new one that will give us better economies of scale and also allow us to bring in some tooling efficiencies and ways of working. And provide organizations with a way so that maybe they don't have to employ such expensive resources in every single team. However, what we don't want to do is go back to the old way of doing things. So we recognize that what we're trying to go fast, we're trying to scale, but DevOps came in as a result of silos because people were throwing things over the wall. So we don't want to just introduce another barrier to people where instead of throwing it to operations, you throw it to a platform team. So explicitly building in a decision that actually we need to reduce both the technical and the social barriers of developers being able to build and maintain and move their system to production in a fast way is key to moving forward. And as I said, this creates quite a big sort of cognitive load on your general developers in terms of them having to really kind of understand all these different pieces in building that. So we want to reduce that and make sure they can just focus on what they need. And finally, we recognize that this is not something that's going to just happen overnight. We've got potentially a system that needs to deal with a large organization with lots of different teams, and so we need a long-term strategic way of moving forward. And that is where the ideal sort of setup of platform engineering comes in. Now you can see how things like maybe a self-service offering would address some of these sort of challenges that I spoke about because it promotes fast flow. You don't need to worry about developers having to raise tickets and hundreds of things in order to provision a system. They can just kind of consume that. So this is the ideal kind of setup. Now, I've put this together in a bit of a workflow. You don't need to worry about the specifics at the moment, but essentially it just shows us these were the problems and the drivers that we were considering. Then we had the decisions and then the ultimate solution space, which is the ideal sort of platform setup. Now, we'll go into some of this a little bit later, but don't worry about the details for the moment. So this is great. We know that platform engineering is the answer, so we go about starting to build the solution. Now, just a side note on this, I have actually given a previous talk, which is how do you go about specifically building a platform engineering initiative and all the things that kind of go with that. And I'm not going to go into that particular detail at this point in time, but if you want to have a look at that, you can have a look. There's a short and a long version of that particular talk, one on GOTO and one on PlatformCon. But whether people are sort of looking at talks or they're trying to figure out how to do this, organizations are still really struggling. And this really got me thinking, like, why is that the case? Is there something that's particularly more difficult or challenging with platform engineering than meets the eye? And that's really where this talk was born. So the clue is really in the title of the talk. So the title is, why is it so hard to create a great platform as a product? And in the title, I give away my firm belief that, creating great platforms are really kind of forged in the fires of platform as a product or product thinking mindset. But it seems to be that it's when we try to apply this as a product a bit to the platforms where things start to go a little bit more, or they become a bit more challenging. Now, in theory, and on paper, it works really well. So when you're kind of, looking at conference talks or the obvious success cases out there, it seems to be simple enough to follow. But when you're in big enterprises and organizations, suddenly the practice seems to be a little bit harder to implement. So we're going to have a look at why is that the case. But first of all, as I said, the key answer here is that we believe that platforms should be created as a product. So we just need to understand, first of all, what is so significant about that? What makes the platform as a product concept important for us to get right? So platform as a product is really based on product thinking. And product thinking is really key to creating a great product, and that's regardless of whether it's a platform or just any other kind of product. And this is because it prevents us from building something that users don't actually want. So with product thinking, the whole point of it is that you need to focus and put your users front and center of what you do. And at a high level, what this means is that we need to kind of take the time to chat with our users, understand what the problem space is, how are the ways that we can help solve them, and then come up with a solution sort of collectively together. And this is actually a diagram from a guy called Philip Engel about divergent thinking, but it still illustrates the point quite well. So it's all really about being user-centric and making sure that, as I say, we can apply this to platforms. Now, the problem sometimes comes in when, and many platforms will often fail when sometimes you have platform teams which will go into a bit of a dark room, they will dream up the utopian platform, they will build it, and then they will give it to the developers, and they'll say, here you go, here's your platform. And the developers just won't use it because it won't actually be helpful at all. And the problem is because we haven't done a proper product market fit. And product thinking uses techniques and approaches and tools to help us make sure that we can bridge that gap between what is actually required from the end user perspective and what the solution space is that we're actually building. So, secondly, I would say that all products they have the sort of properties that they need to be useful and desirable. Now, this means that we don't want a product that's just a ragtag collection of different sort of features, but something that will really be, it's cohesive and it gives an end result to your users. Now, product thinking, as I said, it helps us to employ some of these techniques and approaches and tools to do this correctly. Now, the research will show us that actually users are generally not interested in individual features when they're trying to do something. They're interested in the ultimate end outcome. So if you think about a platform, your platform may offer particular things like we do secrets management through Vault, or we also have pipelines, and we have Argo CD things to do this. Your developers and your end users will generally not be interested in that. What they will be interested in is how do I do one-click deployment? Just give me the easy way to go from A to B. And product thinking helps us think that way and not think in these individual features, but how do we solve the end problem? And finally, whether it's an Apple iPhone or something like that, you've got to think about the longer term planning. So you understand if you're using your phone, when you get upgrades, how do those work? And it's the same thing for a platform. If you are, for example, providing Kubernetes as a service to your community, you need to understand what happens when we upgrade. Am I able to pull the sort of version out from underneath developers and slot another one in? People need to understand what this looks like, and that means you need to have a long-term plan with roadmaps so that people can consume and use things appropriately. And that includes providing support. So in short, platform as a product concept really relies quite heavily on the product thinking mindset, the tools and the techniques. And this is so that we can help create a really good fit-for-purpose platform. So we want to make sure that we can apply this concept correctly to our platform situation. Now, just by way of, additionally, if you've looked at the technology radar that comes out from ThoughtWorks, you'll have seen that there's a section in there which talks about applying product management techniques to internal platform teams. And this has been in the adoption phase since May 2020. So what I'm talking about here is not necessarily something new, but it still seems to be something that people actually are struggling with. So this is just some useful resources if you want a bit more background on some of these subjects. So Manuel Pace has a talk on platform as a product, which is really quite good. And I actually found a blog post by Naram Kataman on its Product Thinking 101, which actually gives you, I think, quite a nice simplified version of the type of things that you want to be thinking about here. But that's great. We now know that product thinking is the way to, platform engineering is the way to go. But the question is, why can't we quite seem to get this right? And this is because we often have some sort of stumbling blocks that we tend to hit when we practically try to implement this concept in our organizations. So let's explore what those are. So the first one, I would say, is that we have a tendency to maybe not afford the platform the same considerations that you might if you were dealing with a traditional external product or a product that's going out to ultimate end customers. And why is that the case? Well, first of all, if you think about it, the users from a platform engineering perspective are really your internal developers and the other communities that are consuming that. But because they're internal users, we can often take them for granted. And this is because we sometimes think, well, we have quite a good inside track into how developers think. We are developers, we're building it for developers, so maybe we can short-circuit some of the thinking and the techniques to actually do what is required. Now, this is not necessarily intentional, however, assumptions are often made about the users, including things like their abilities. So we might think, well, as a developer, you should be able to work with a YAML file, and that should be simple enough to do. So maybe that's an interface, which is fine. We can let them use that. We also might make assumptions about what's best for them. So we might have ideas as to the best CI/CD approach to sort of go with and impose that on developers as the way that the platform will actually implement that. Or indeed, you might actually just sort of take for granted the fact that you have a very captive audience. Your internal developers can't go anywhere, unlike external sort of users. And so if you're pushing a feature out, there's sometimes a temptation to say, well, they're just internal users. So maybe it's not quite ready, but we're going to kind of push it out anyway. Now, this can sometimes be known as the false consensus effect. And as I said, it comes about because sometimes we believe that we know what's best. So we might say, well, as a developer, as I say, I identify, there's consensus around how a particular thing would work, and so we'll just short-circuit that particular question in asking the users and actually just implement it a particular way. And ultimately, just kind of decide for them. However, if we have a look at, so the green bit is our ultimate sort of utopian sort of platform engineering initiative, but when we make these assumptions, we're trying to do maybe simplified abstractions over complex sort of infrastructure. But as a developer, as an engineer, you might say, well, my version of simple is that everybody should be able to work with a CLI, or everybody should be able to work with a particular format, and kind of make that decision for the users. Now, ideally, you wouldn't do this if you were working with an external users. You would actually take the time to speak to them, to ask them what is it that you actually need. You'd probably conduct surveys, and this is the same type of thing that should happen when you're building a product. So just because they're internal users, don't kind of think that actually I can short-circuit this. Now, product thinking also provides you with a way to be able to incorporate feedback loops into the life cycle. And when we're doing this from a platform perspective, we might need to think a little bit laterally, because there's not just user surveys, there might be other ways that we can incorporate feedback into the process. And one of the ways that you can do this is to maybe embed some of your engineers into some of the application teams to actually help them out. And this can come about through things like enablement teams. So this is from the team topologies language. And this is where the social side of the platform engineering discipline actually comes into play. So yes, you don't necessarily, you might take your users for granted in an internal concept, but it actually gives you an inside track in one way to have access to them, and you should take advantage of that. So all right, we understand that we may be taking our internal users for granted. But additionally, I would say that most platform teams, because they don't actually ship an actual product, they tend to fall into the trap of being sort of labeled as a cost center. And this can cause a lot of problems as well if it's not recognized. So typically what happens in this case is that your platform will manifest as being run as a project rather than a product. And the sort of focus will be on just delivering a certain amount of features to a particular deadline rather than looking at a whole sort of product roadmap, etc. And the problem with this is that it runs the risk of having cost-cutting measures associated with it. And you need the overall, the whole sort of platform engineering bundle to get it right. So what does this look like in practice? So we're going to go back to this sub-portion of that sort of flow that I showed you before. We've got our sort of business drivers on the left, we've got our decisions on the right, and we have our ideal platform on the right and our decisions in the middle. So in this particular case, we've recognized we need to establish a long-term initiative, and we're running our platform as a product. Now, when cost-cutting becomes the primary driver, what will typically happen in most organizations is that people will have a look at what's going on and they'll say, right, what is revenue generating and what is not? And when they identify something that is not revenue generating, they'll say, this is probably where we can cut costs. This is where we can minimize the kind of work. And the problem is that because your platform, if it's not seen as a revenue generating product, runs a risk, as I say, of being classified as a cost center, and then you'll end up having these cuts applied to you. So what will typically happen, or what we've seen happen, is that people need to save money, so they'll say, all right, well, you're just going to get X amount of money, do the best that you can in order to implement as many features as you can to help the developers. And because you're now constrained with some of the money that you've got to sacrifice things. And often the things that will get sacrificed will be things maybe like your developer relations type roles that are out there. So if you were doing this for an external product, it would be quite natural to have marketing type roles in there in order to promote your product. But when you've got to save money, then these are some of the things that land up actually kind of getting cost, which means you take away some of the key features needed to ultimately develop and produce a good platform as a product. Now, the antidote to this, as I noted sort of earlier, in the ideal case is really to make sure that you can convey the business value of the platform to your leadership. And one of the ways to try and do this is to convince them that it's a revenue or a faster route to market enabler. Now, I will admit that this is not easily done. It's not simple by any stretch of the imagination, and it takes a lot of tact and sort of chatting with people, and it's not simple. But it is one of the ways that you can, one of the sort of things that you can do in order to make sure that you get to the point where if it's treated as a product, you'll get the fuller kind of funding. So one of the practical ways that you can do this is maybe suggest the use of metrics. So you could say to leadership, look, when people are using the platform, they go 10 times faster in actually deploying to production as they do if they just do it themselves. If we're trying to scale the organization and ramp up to another sort of 20 teams, this will mean we can go to market X times sort of faster, we'll be in front of the competition, it will enable us to start revenue generating earlier. And these are the type of things that leadership will have a look at and say, okay, maybe we can fund this a little bit differently. So in summary, I would say that from the sort of first perspective of not sort of affording the platform the same considerations is because you're internal, your users are internal, don't let the familiarity of actually kind of working within internal IT prevent you from actually taking the time to speak to your users and to engage with them in order to help you shape the platform. And also make sure that you can understand how to sell the business value of the platform. Because if you can do this, you will then avoid that sort of cost center trap and get the funding that you need to actually build a quality product. So that was the first item. The second one is around, there's sometimes often an insistence that we should make the platform mandatory for everybody. Now, the challenge with this, if you think about it, is that nobody generally forces you to buy an Apple phone or to consume AWS services. You will generally do so because you believe that it's worth it. And product thinking understands this. It understands that there's inherent competition in the way things are done. And it gears its techniques to say, well, how can we build some feedback loops in to make sure that we can understand what is good and that we can continually improve the product so that it gets better and more attractive to our users as a result. But the problem with a platform is that if you make it mandatory, you'll end up cutting off and closing off some of these feedback loops. Whereas if you go for an optional approach, you invite more innovation and discussions which will help you to actually create a better product in the first place. So, because sometimes what your users will say is, well, why should I bother giving feedback? Because actually, nobody listens. It's going to force me to do it this particular way anyway. And so you kind of cut off some of those helpful things. Now, there can be a few reasons for this, and I'm just going to pick on one particular area at the moment. And that is that sometimes the platform is seen as a way to primarily or purely enforce security and regulatory compliance. Now, don't get me wrong, there is nothing wrong with this. In fact, it's actually sort of one of the drivers, and it's something which is really important. But when it becomes the primary driver or the sole reason for the creation of the platform, the focus will shift off of how do we make this easy for people to actually use into how can we get them to comply with as least amount of fuss as possible. So what does that actually kind of look like when we do this? So again, we start with our ideal scenario. We've got our long-term initiative, we've got our platform funded as a product, and we've got some sensible sort of standardization in there. When the security aspect becomes the primary driver, the language will often kind of shift, and you'll often hear this from sort of security say, well, we need to mandate this. This absolutely has to be enforced. And sometimes, because they might see, well, the platform, there's majority of the people are on the platform, so maybe we can just force everything to go through the platform, and then there's just one place for us to have to implement this as a security team, and we don't have to worry about dealing with all the different sort of individual sort of teams out there. And if you'll excuse the pun, they kind of use it sometimes as a Trojan horse to actually kind of get the core sort of security bits in there. However, this is, when you do this, basically it makes it really, as I say, it makes it really kind of difficult, because ultimately the property of the platform will change to become mandatory. Because there's only one way for the security to be enforced, the platform becomes mandatory, and then you land up with other problems that I spoke about not having the feedback loops, or it being a little bit harder to get these feedback loops. But this is a genuine concern, and people do use the platform to actually incorporate security. So you'll ask, well, how do I do this? If I don't make it mandatory, how do I get people to comply with things? And I would say the answer to this is generally to give people a choice. So you make it quite clear to them, this is what's required from a security or regulatory compliance in order for you to meet X criteria. And you have a choice. You can either do it yourself, or you can use the platform. Obviously, you need to build the platform and make it sort of the ideal approach so that they will choose your platform rather than doing it themselves. And this is, what you really want to try and do is entice them on so that you use a carrot rather than a stick approach. Now, if I give you a specific example here, it may be that your platform is, somebody wants to build a public-facing service. And you can say, well, actually, the platform, we have got some pre-approved templates that will generate it for you. It's been approved by security, so they understand what the risk metrics are. Or what the risk profile is. And if you use that on the platform, you can go straight to, you can just deploy, there's no barriers, and then you can just start building the rest of your application. However, if for whatever reason you can't use the platform, by all means you can do it yourself. However, then it's up to you. You need to go to security, you need to get things ticked off. You need to get them to get the time to see you, etc., etc. And sometimes that in itself can actually be an incentive for people because they think, oh, it's going to be so difficult if I have to do this myself, so maybe I should use the platform anyway. So the summary for this one is that what you really want to do here is, whilst it's not always easy, and you often have to strongly encourage people onto the platform with various different ways, you want to try and do this rather with a carrot rather than a stick approach. And so avoiding the pressure to try and make the platform mandatory through these various different ways will help because you'll enable the feedback loops that are needed, whereas if it's mandatory, you close that off, and it's harder for you to actually get the feedback in order to build something that is fit for purpose. Now, competition is a good thing, even for a platform. And from a platform perspective, the competition should be the current model. But it's your job as a platform engineering team to make sure that the platform is actually the one that wins and the one that is easy to use. So our third area where people often stumble is that they sort of optimize for what I call a mono platform. So oftentimes you will find that people are drawn to building things the one right way. And rather than recognizing that actually the platform could be composed of a number of different sort of areas that are carefully curated and brought together to offer a cohesive offering. But we're kind of constantly drawn to this one mono platform to rule them all concept. And why is that the case? So I've broken this down into about three sort of sub-areas. The first one is what I call mono coverage. And this is where there's an assumption that the platform must cater for absolutely every single use case out there. So you might be going through a digital transformation, you're trying to transform some of your legacy estate into a new cloud-native approach. And the question is, does every single app need to land in the platform? And I'd argue probably not. There might be cases where you say, well, actually a lift and shift is more appropriate for this particular sort of application, and it might not fit very well in a cloud-native platform. And that's not necessarily a problem. But if you try and force everything in there and build a platform that also caters for lift and shift, all that happens is that you end up diluting your offering and you become a sort of jack of all trades and a master of none. So typically what I would suggest you do here is to opt for like the 80-20 rule, or you could actually call it the 90-10 or whatever sort of percentage you want to put in there. But what you want to find out is what is the core use cases, what are the core scenarios that will add the most value to people to really enable the business drivers, and that's what the platform will focus on. It's okay to recognize that there's a certain subset of people that are just not going to fit on the platform and they will need to do things themselves. And this is sometimes quite hard for people to do because they're trying to fit everything into the same sort of package. The second sub-point here is what I call mono implementations. And this is the assumption that we have to offer one particular way for a particular feature or offering within the platform. So I'm going to pick on CI/CD again in this case. And you might believe that there is one sort of correct way to do this. Maybe that's the false consensus effect coming into play. Or maybe as a team you just don't have enough bandwidth to support hundreds of different sort of features out there, and so you're just trying to build one particular way of doing things. But the reality is that for a platform to be really kind of helpful, it generally will need to have a few offerings. So maybe you need a GitOps approach as well as a push model for some people, or maybe you do need certain different sort of technologies. You need to find a way to balance these two. So again, the suggestion that I would make here is to find out what is the majority of the cases that are going to solve the main sort of challenge for the user, and give them a choice then out of that. So it may be that there's 2 or 3 options, and you can say we're going to support these 3, and you can choose out of these 3, but that's it. What I wouldn't suggest is that you just offer everything, because that becomes a bit of a free-for-all, and that's even worse. You'll end up in a worse situation rather than picking the ones that might make the most sense and just focusing on that. You might have to shepherd people though as well. So if you pick those 3, part of platform engineering is also trying to shepherd people into the right direction, and that involves working with them through your support teams and enablement teams, etc. as well. And the final one in this section is what I call monotech, and that is really the assumption that all paths land up on the same, or all workloads need to land up on the same technological sort of destination. And this is where I'm looking at Kubernetes. So there are a lot of companies out there that have standardized on Kubernetes as their platform. Does this mean that every single workload has to land in Kubernetes? No, it doesn't. So I just make this statement because a lot of people think that this is the case. But if you think, for example, maybe databases, it might be perfectly fine for you to consume a cloud-native database from a database provider. Or maybe it's even more efficient to run it on a VM. Not everything has to run in Kubernetes. And you just need to kind of take a horses for courses approach with this one. So in summary here, in the real world, you seldom get a one-size-fits-all type offering which is able to reach an entire market. And when you're building a platform, you need to be aware of falling into the thinking that you can either corner the entire market, or indeed that you can actually kind of shoehorn engineers into just one way of doing things. So pragmatism is required here, but if you focus on sort of building for the majority of the use cases and letting the other people actually do their own thing, then that will get you a good platform. So our fourth sort of stumbling block here occurs when we're actually trying to put the teams together that will build the platform and help the teams out. And sometimes we have assumptions and sort of ways of doing things that land up with us creating less than ideal team setups. Now the first one in this case is when you get more infrastructure-focused platform, or just predominantly infrastructure-focused platform teams. So for many companies, when they're starting to actually build out a platform initiative, it will predominantly be staffed with infrastructure engineers. And this is very natural because it's an ops-centric sort of platform. It needs to do things like infrastructure as code and all of these type of activities. But the problem that we observe is that when you kind of skew your team in this direction, you naturally land up with solutions that are very ops-centric. And rather than kind of looking at including some of these other roles in there to make sure that the developers are catered for and their way of doing things and some of the things that really matter to them are included. So I would really strongly advise not to sort of just think about creating platform teams that have only got infrastructure engineers, but to bring in some of this other mindset. Now, the product owner is another really key role within a platform team. And unfortunately, in many cases, this is actually kind of just missing or not even present at all. Now, if we have a look at, this is from the State of DevOps 2023 report, one of their conclusions that they come to is that organizations are really underinvesting in product management skills within a platform team. And the product owner is really important because they are the ones that will really kind of set the mindset for the product thinking. They'll make sure that we engage the users, that they can evangelize to the rest of the organization. So when this role is missing, there's a huge gap that needs to be filled. Now, if you look at some of the stats here, when people tend to create their teams, about 48% will staff it with DevOps people, which means different things to different people, but that's what they staff it with. About 45% with software engineers and 44% with platform engineers. But the product management, the product role sometimes is the one that is missing. Now, why does this happen? So if you think about how these teams often come into play, again, it might be that people just take an existing infrastructure team and they convert them into a platform team, and they kind of move from this one role to the other. And it's just not natural for a lot of internal IT projects to think in a product mindset. And so it's really difficult for them to take this on. Now, again, one of the things that might happen is that we might say, well, we know we need a product owner, so let's just pick somebody in the team and we'll pick a principal engineer or something and say, you're going to be the product owner or the product sort of manager. And the challenge with that is that that's fine if they have the skills to be able to do that. But product management is a skill in and of itself. So if you just kind of pick somebody and they don't have that capability, it can be, you have the product owner in name, but not necessarily in the actual skills that are needed to deliver it. Now, the second issue here, and I'm going to now contradict myself and be slightly controversial at the same time, is that if you have a pure play sort of product management role that doesn't have any kind of technical background, I would say that that is less than ideal. It's not negative, but it's less than ideal. And the reason for this is because, well, first of all, having a product owner in the first place, you definitely want that because they bring in this fantastic product thinking mindset. But when the technology side or a lack of understanding of that is present, it makes things a little bit more difficult in terms of maybe understanding, empathizing with some of your end kind of users, which are developers in this case. And it can be helpful if you have to kind of referee between some of the features that are coming in, and having an understanding at least of the domain is helpful. So it's not a showstopper by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly is more helpful to have somebody with at least a bit of a technical background. So first of all, investing in the product management skills first and foremost, and having a product owner is the thing that you want to do, and if possible, somebody that's got a bit of a technical background as well. So finally, the last bit in this section is where we have static or non-evolvable teams. So when the platform teams, platform engineering initiatives are set up, sometimes we can think, okay, we've put our team together, they're going to build the platform, and that's it. But the challenge is that you've got to think a little bit long-term as well, like how do we support the end users? You might need a support function, professional services, all these type of things in order to actually make this work properly. So we find, again, the concept of enablement teams from team topologies is a great way to do this. So when you can take maybe some of your engineers and make them available to some of the streamlined teams out there, you can use that to work out what do they actually need. So you might be building something and say, well, actually, whilst we've been part of those teams, this is not really where the problem is. They're really struggling with this. So let's bring that back and change the platform and bring that sort of knowledge in. So if you're static, you don't really have the sort of freedom to be able to do that. So the summary for this section is really that when you're thinking about putting your teams together, you should avoid trying to skew the makeup of the teams into just core infrastructure engineers. You need a mixture, you need a bit of a appropriate match. And we really need to recognize that there is a specific need for product management skills and expertise. And don't neglect thinking about including the support side as well. And finally, and this is probably more of an overall summary point rather than a particular fifth point, is that as engineers, we seem to have a very unhealthy focus on technology. We love to start building something. So when a platform engineering initiative comes along, the first thing we want to do is grab Kubernetes and start building on top and doing all of these activities. But you need to resist the urge to do that. So the answer here is really very simple, which is just step away from the keyboard and actually engage your users first. So the summary, as I say, for this section is really that, and a lot of the areas we've spoken about, is that platform engineering is a socio-technical discipline. It involves both the social and the technical side. And if you only focus on the technical, that will be to your detriment. So you need to kind of suppress this natural urge to solve things by just focusing on the shiny new tech and actually engaging your users first and treating your platform as a product. So we're aware of all of these blind spots and these sort of stumbling blocks that might kind of get into our way. What does a good user-centric platform actually look like then? So this is going to be different depending on different contexts. So each organization is very different. But I would argue that there are some common sort of properties and principles that they tend to exhibit when they're done right. We're just briefly going to go through some of these. So the first one is that they've got really clear messaging and communication. So it's really clear what's included and what's not. So this is an example of something called Cloud Kafka, which is actually a public Kafka as a service offering. But it's really easy for you to see, well, what are the things that they offer? Well, we get fully managed clusters, we get monitoring and alarms, and being able to actually provide your developers with something like this means it's really easy for them to understand which bits they can rely on and the different sort of teams and which bits are not. Also, there's really clear sort of lines of roles and responsibilities. So for the different offerings that you have, you need to say, this is a responsibility that the platform is going to take, and this is what you as a developer or you as a tenant on the platform need to take responsibility for. And it helps people to understand, like, what is, you know, where's my integration point or my interaction point with the platform. And as I said before, you don't just want to have Confluence out there with just a whole bunch of pages for all stuff platform engineering related. You want to say, what are the outcomes that people are trying to achieve, and actually create guided golden sort of paths and instruction sets that will allow people to achieve their end outcomes in an easy way. Now, a good platform is also going to be intuitive and very kind of user-focused. So as I said before, it's not going to solve the entire world's problem, but it's going to focus on solving it for the majority of the people that will really kind of benefit for it, and it will leave the rest to actually do what they need to do. It will address actual pain points because you've spoken to your users, you've conducted surveys, and it's also targeted at the right level. So when I speak about the right level, if you think about how you might want to consume a one-click deployment, is it more that I want to understand all the nuts and bolts of Kubernetes under the covers, or do I want more of a Heroku experience? And I would argue that most of your users don't want the Kubernetes. They will skew more towards a Heroku experience. So finding that abstraction level, where is it that the platform needs to build, is really important. And also, what's the most appropriate way? Do they want a GUI or a CLI, or you know, what is the option here? Also, really important, a really good platform is going to actively look to incorporate feedback loops into the process. So as I said before, this can be done through things like user surveys. So this can be done at the beginning in terms of finding out what your users want. But you want to continually do this as well, to say, is our platform actually helping you? What are the features that are missing? What are the type of things that we can change to make it, to improve it? And doing this in the open, so sort of coding in the open, making your roadmap available for people to see, will enable them to see what's coming up, what they can start using and planning for as part of the platform. Now, a good way, I think, to get some feedback is to use an RFC process. So this is a request for comment. So if you're going to, let's say you want to offer a database as a service as a next feature, you can say, well, this is coming up in Q3 or Q4 of your roadmap. Publish it as an RFC and allow your users to comment on it. And what you might find is that people will say, oh, actually, I need that, but the design that you've got there, it's not quite going to sort of cater for my needs, so can we think about incorporating this aspect or that aspect? And then you've suddenly got this feedback loop, which is really engaging your users and using things like enablement teams. I'll just go quickly. Providing solid sort of day two support is another thing that they will provide. So making sure you have the professional services and the sort of support available for them, making it really clear how do you interact with the team, are there Slack channels, is there a ticketing system, you know, how do we kind of do this? And as I said before, making sure that you have a platform that has got a reliable long-term outlook. So with the ones that are really successful, it has executive C-level buy-in. They also understand the vision. There is backing and funding for it, and you can see what's coming up. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that I really do believe that building great platforms are forged in the fires of platform as a product or product thinking mindset. But you do need to be aware that when you do this, there are some stumbling blocks that you might encounter. And this is either because you as a sort of a person or maybe an organization have things which are very natural or default to you that you sort of land up doing, but they work against you if you're not aware of them. So I've put them here on one slide for your convenience. But if you can kind of get over some of these things, you will land up building, hopefully, or get on the road to building a very good platform as a product. And that is the end of my talk.